What happens when people lie in God's name just to get what they want? This is the story of Brother Elijah and Sister Rachel. Two young believers. Two ambitious hearts. And one desperate desire, marriage. At first glance, their story might even make you laugh. A funny, almost childish attempt to outsmart the system. But as the layers unfold, you'll discover a journey filled with regret, sorrow, and lessons that echo far beyond their own lives. Because at the center of this story is one sobering truth: you can trick men, but you cannot trick God. To understand Elijah and Rachel's actions, you need to understand the deeper life marriage system. Unlike the world, where marriage is often rushed, emotional, and careless, deeper life has a carefully designed structure. It begins with prayers. Both the brother and sister are expected to seek God's face, not just their emotions. Then comes revelation checks. Each person must share what they believe God showed them in dreams, visions, or inward convictions. After that, counseling sessions follow, where elders probe to ensure both parties are mature, spiritually prepared, and compatible. And finally, there's the medical examination, especially genotype testing, to prevent avoidable suffering in the future. This system wasn't meant to frustrate young people. It was designed to protect them, to shield them from mistakes that can ruin lives, ministries, and futures. But for Elijah and Rachel, it felt like a prison. They didn't want the waiting. They didn't want the probing questions. They didn't want the long process. In their minds, they already knew what they wanted. They feared rejection if they relied on truth. And so, they hatched a plan. A plan to lie. Not just a small lie, but a lie in the name of God Himself. The lie. Brother Elijah went first. Sitting before the marriage committee, with all the seriousness of a prophet, he spoke. I saw Sister Rachel in a revelation. She was standing with me at the altar. I held her hands. We were dressed in white, and I knew she was God's choice for me. The committee members nodded slowly, writing down his words. They had heard many such testimonies before, some genuine, some questionable. But Elijah sounded convincing, almost rehearsed. Then the marriage committee invited Sister Rachel. She leaned forward, her voice soft, her eyes pretending to shine with conviction. I saw a revelation. In the dream, Brother Elijah was reading the Bible to me. He held my hand and explained scriptures. I felt peace, and I knew he was the one. The room fell silent for a moment. Their stories seemed to align perfectly. Too perfectly. But the committee, perhaps weary of over-questioning young people, accepted it at face value. And just like that, Elijah and Rachel outsmarted the system. Or so they thought. Rachel walked out of the room and called Elijah. See? We made it through. They believed us. Soon we'll be married in deeper life. To them, it was a victory. But in heaven's eyes, it was a ticking time bomb. Because God is not mocked. The crisis of genotype. The final stage was the medical check. Elijah and Rachel went in casually, not expecting any problem. After all, they had done the hard work of lying. This, they thought, would just be routine. But the results came back with a shock. Both Elijah and Rachel were AS. In genetic terms, this was dangerous. It meant that if they married, there was a high risk of giving birth to children with sickle cell disease. A lifetime of hospital visits. A future filled with pain. The marriage committee sat them down gently. We have seen your medical results. We must advise you not to proceed. This is not about church rules, it's about protecting your future children. Marriage is not just about love today, it is about responsibility tomorrow. But instead of humbling themselves, Elijah and Rachel grew angry. Brother Elijah snapped, so you want to scatter our plans? You think you know better than God? Didn't I tell you God showed me Rachel in a revelation? So what is this genotype to stop God's will? Sister Rachel nodded furiously, yes. This is man's wisdom, not God's wisdom. If God wants us to be together, no sickness will come. You people are blocking our joy. The elders tried to explain further, pleading with them to reconsider. But their hearts were already hardened. They stormed out of the church office, hand in hand, whispering angrily, these people don't want us to be happy. We'll prove them wrong. And within weeks, Elijah and Rachel took their wedding elsewhere, to another church that asked no questions, required no revelations, and demanded no medical checks. They thought they had escaped. But in reality, they had only stepped into a storm. The consequences. They left the deeper life hall with hands held and eyes bright. The wedding, in another church that asked no questions and listened to no probing, felt like vindication. Friends clapped. Photos were taken. They wore their joy like armor. For a while, the world agreed with their choice. The apartment was small but theirs. Visitors brought rice and goodwill. The couple bragged in private about outsmarting the committee. We told them what they wanted to hear, they joked. Now look at us. Then the first child arrived, a fragile, beautiful thing that turned every fear into new hope. But hope, in their case, was fragile. At 3 months old, the baby began to cry in ways that sounded different, to develop fevers that felt like knives in the night. Nights at the clinic followed, then tests. The doctor's face changed when the blood result arrived. It's sickle cell disease, he said, quietly. Genotype SS. Those letters, S and S, hung in the room heavier than anyone expected. They described a lifelong condition, pain crises, hospital admissions, infections that come with frightening speed. Treatment would be possible, but it would be a life lived with an invisible chain of suffering. The kind of suffering that wears a family down slowly, clinically. They had been warned. The genotype conversation had happened weeks before. There's a risk. If both parents are AS, there's a chance of SS. The elders had used the language of caution, of love for future children. At the time, Elijah and Rachel had scoffed. Faith will fix it, they had said. Or worse, they had convinced themselves that the committee had no right to speak into their happiness. Now the cost of that impatience showed in a screaming infant and opioid smells in a hospital ward. They learned the rhythms of emergency rooms. They learned to sleep on plastic chairs between shifts. They learned the phone call that could come at 3 in the morning. They learned how quickly money disappears when blood transfusion bills arrive. They watched friends' pity shift into a strained, practical concern. Who would lend the money this time? They prayed. They cried. They negotiated with nurses. They found community where they could. But the strain mounted like unseen bricks piled on their chest. Months later, when they dared to welcome a second child, a fragile hope rose in both hearts. Maybe the first had been a fluke. Maybe the second child would be spared. The second pregnancy brought joy and fear in equal measure. But months into the child's life, the tiny body began to show the same cruel symptoms. Fever after fever. A hospital admission that turned into another. Their hope was like a candle in wind. It burned through friction and finally gutted out. The second child did not recover. The death certificate read like a judgment, but no court had sentenced them. Their grief was raw, unscripted. Friends came with casseroles and whispered words that could not stitch the empty space where a child had been. The funeral was small, heavy. The couple stood side by side, hollowed and young. The community watched. Some sympathized with the rawness of the loss. Others, quieter, remembered the committee's caution and said nothing, or said it later in awkward whispers. If heartbreak had been the only cost, it would have been too much already. But suffering is rarely solitary. A third child came 3 years later, another fragile life. The joy this time was threaded with trepidation. Genetic counseling had been suggested. The elders had urged them to seek treatment options and to brace for the long haul. But a pattern had already taken hold. Helpless visits to cold clinics, nights sat in sterile wards, the same machines and the same coughs. The third child, too, bore the mark. Another SS result. Another series of hospitalizations. Another round of transfusions and medications that cost more than the family would have imagined spending in a lifetime. The result was predictable in a way the young couple had refused to acknowledge. Their choices had consequences, consequences that landed on bodies without a vote. Children, innocent and helpless, paid the largest price for decisions made in impatience and pride. Hospitals became a second home. Work suffered. Jobs were precarious because absence for treatment looked like neglect to some employers. Savings evaporated like a mirage. Debt crept in until it became a constant companion. Borrowed money turned into humiliation. Parents mortgaged land. The economy of their home convulsed under the weight of medical need. And when exhaustion smoothed the edges of grief into numbed routine, what had been love at first became a ledger of grievances. The downfall. Grief, when left to fester, turns to accusation. A slammed cupboard is not just a sound, it is an argument that has found a voice. A curt sentence after a night in the clinic becomes a verdict. Elijah would come home from the clinic, face gaunt from nights in the hospital, and find Rachel staring at a new bill. The words came brittle now. Why didn't we listen? Why did you push the revelation story? Why did we think we were smarter than wisdom? Rachel would answer with equal vehemence, "Why did you insist on proving them wrong? You told me God showed you this was right. We lied together. We carried the lie into a marriage." They had once believed lying to the committee would be a small sin, a white lie to avoid scrutiny, to climb the altar faster. But little lies have a way of widening into life-shaping choices that cannot be unwritten. They argued over money. They argued over the children. One blamed the other for pushing the revelation. One blamed the other for not standing up when it mattered. Friends who had once toasted their courage now crossed the street when they saw them. Pastors who had loved them felt wounded. Some shook their heads. Others whispered, "We tried to help them." Financial strain is an unforgiving teacher. Loans must be repaid. Creditors call. Work becomes scarce when a parent disappears for another week of hospital care. The couple, exhausted and undermined by grief, found their defenses thin and their patience thinner. Remorse grew into a chasm. Neither could remember the face of the other before the hospital lights. Tiredness sharpened into contempt. Each suspected the other of selfishness. The tenderness that had once patched despair was now a rare currency. Eventually, the unthinkable, for their circle, happened. The marriage that had been planned with such secrecy, the marriage that had been defended as a proclamation of love, finally crumbled under the weight of blame and sorrow. It did not die dramatically. It expired with the weary paperwork of a courthouse, signatures inked with hands that trembled not with hope but with surrender. Divorce arrived as silence, as legal formality, as another loss stacked atop the others. The small family that had been a refuge and a symbol became a memory with edges that cut. After divorce, the residue of public shame remained. Both Elijah and Rachel sat with an ache that was equal parts personal failure and spiritual guilt. They had used God's name to justify impatience, they had masqueraded motives as revelation, and the fallout was a litany of human pain. 3 children caught in the aftermath, a funeral, medical bills, and reputational ruin. There are mistakes people can forgive. There are mistakes they cannot easily forget. Lying in the name of God, the elders said quietly later, carries a particular weight. It wounds not only a marriage but the trust the community has in testimony, in the sacred language of revelation that the church guards carefully. They were left broken. Not simply because their marriage failed, but because their choices had harmed the most vulnerable, their children. They had tried to bend God's name to their will and found instead that God's ways require patience, honesty, and love that thinks first of the weak. The lesson. So what do we take from Brother Elijah and Sister Rachel's story? First, spiritual systems, marriage committees, medical checks, counsel, are not there to crush joy. They exist to protect the vulnerable. They are not the enemy of love. They are safeguards so that love has a fair chance to flourish without avoidable suffering for those who cannot speak for themselves. Second, revelation is not a ticket to bypass responsibility. A genuine leading from God greets wisdom, not rejects it. Faith walks with prudence. When elders advise, it is not always a test of submission to man. Sometimes it is an act of obedience to God's care for community. Third, lying in God's name is dangerous. It undermines trust, scars the church, and, in the worst cases, inflicts pain on innocent ones. The tongue can be used to praise God or to manipulate the sacred. Choose carefully. And finally, the hardest question, was it love or lust that blinded them? Was it impatience, raw desire, or a reckless confidence that their emotions could rewrite consequences? Possibly all of the above. Human hearts are complicated. But the consequence is clear. When we act on impulse and deceive in the name of God, the fallout seldom spares the innocent. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: you can trick people. You cannot trick God. Motives are seen. Consequences arrive. Systems are sometimes imperfect, but wisdom has a role. And mercy, always mercy, must guide how we move forward after mistakes. So before you try to bend rules in the name of faith, stop and ask, who will pay if I am wrong? Because in many cases, the ones who pay have the least voice.